Thank you for joining me. I want to talk a bit about the very depressing and painful massacre that occurred on Shabbos in Pittsburgh, where 11 Jews were murdered in cold blood at a synagogue. The worst, as the ADL accurately said, the worst single terrorist incident, the worst anti-Semitic incident in American history. And I would argue that really the only way ultimately to look at something like this, how things have become so utterly evil, what could drive something like this, is to try to understand what anti-Semitism is. It's been said that one of the reasons he targeted the synagogue is because they were involved with a refugee movement. Fine. Why target a Jewish refugee movement? There are plenty of movements like that are not Jewish. That really doesn't explain it. And even if it did, it's evil. I mean, would people have a right to advocate anything they want in this country and in this world? He quoted from the New Testament in one of his tweets, where he said that in the Gospel according to John, Jews are the sons of Satan. And I feel the need to address that in the context of what is anti-Semitism today. You know, it's you need to look at these things in the same way that you look at a train wreck, right, or a plane crash. You need to look at it scientifically. What caused it? Try to understand what went wrong with the plane. Why did it crash, killing people? Was it a design flaw? Was it too old? Was it stress? Was it a pilot error? What happened? And the reason we try to do that is so we can understand and learn lessons, so that maybe that design flaw can be corrected, or the planes maybe will be taken out of commission earlier, or whatever it is, so that we can likely prevent or reduce the number of times this happens in the future. And I think that this situation needs that kind of brief examination from me. I mean, and certainly more in-depth examinations from a lot of people. And that should generally be the discussion, frankly. Now, I also want to just put as a little preface here before I delve in, that while it doesn't address the problem, it certainly addresses the symptom. When President Trump quite accurately says that there should be more armed guards at synagogues or at other locations which might be targeted for this kind of terrorism. Now, I don't know about, armed guards per se, but I would take a lesson from the state of Israel and how they've handled these sorts of situations. In 1973, there was the Ma'alot attack, where two Islamic terrorists crossed the border into Israel and they took hostage a nursery school. The result was 50 children were murdered. How did Israel respond to this? Well, what happened is that Israel called up retired military people, policemen, security people to guard the schools and to guard other soft targets, so to speak. So the result is you had boobies and zadies, grandmas and grandpas mostly, uncles and aunts, who had gone into retirement and who were happy to do it, simply go to the school and keep an eye on things. And these are people who knew how to use weapons and do. And the result is that, someone's commenting on my hair. Thanks a lot. Anyway, the result is that it was a huge reduction in the number of these instances. It was a common sense thing to do. It addressed the symptom, it didn't address the problem, which was, why do people want to kill Jewish children? That's a bigger question. But I think that in terms of addressing the symptom, that's one thing that we could do very easily in this country. And I'm not just saying for Jewish schools or synagogues. I would argue all schools. Look at Parkland shooting. I mean, any school, besides tightening up security measures and securing their buildings, let's have retired policemen, retired military people, retired security people go in and guard them. They'd love to do it, I'm sure. Most people would. Why not? I mean, I'm nearing age of retirement. If I was trained that way, I'd probably do it. But I want to address in this case, now that I've said that, I want to address the question of anti-Semitism. It's a much bigger and much more deeper question. I've written a book on the topic. It's called Left-Wing Anti-Semitism, not to get in a plug. But the premise of my book is that anti-Semitism is anti-Americanism. It's anti-Western civilization. It's anti-Christian. It's anti all of the things that we believe in this country. Capitalism, the right to private ownership, the right to trade goods and services, moral standards, belief in God, belief in family, belief in love. Things that we look to as progressive ideas. And why do I say that? Well, first of all, the Jews represent those things. Judaism and the Jewish people generally, and I'm not talking about the exceptions, which are the occasional criminal, of course. I mean, that's human nature, and the occasional bad actor. But for the most part, the Jewish people and Judaism as a faith teaches those things. It teaches a faith which calls for the individual to lift themselves up from their own bootstraps and create their own lives. It's a creative, dynamic, organic belief that we are not to depend on external forces because we can't. And I think we certainly learned that after 2,000 years of diaspora, not having our own nation state. We had to depend on those of others. And in that capacity, we understood that we were really ultimately operating as independent players. We had to take care of ourselves. We had to be creative in sometimes very adversarial situations. And thus we developed a strong sense of individuality and a strong sense of self-sufficiency. Now, also Judaism as a faith teaches values like family, education, unity, conservative values, community cohesion and helping each other, charity, doing good deeds. These are all Jewish values. And this is really the root of anti-Semitism as well. Now, I want to get into a painful question here, which is, frankly, Christian anti-Semitism. I think that this killer might have had at least a reasonable dose of that. And that's something I'm not going to tiptoe around here. The fact of the matter is that traditionally, Christianity has viewed itself as a replacement religion, that with the advent of the ministry of Jesus, Judaism was no longer needed. It was no longer wanted because Jesus had a new covenant with God, and he offered that covenant through belief in him as the Messiah and as the Savior. And thus, the fact that Judaism did not accept Jesus's ministry, they had relegated themselves to irrelevancy. And it goes a step further, which is that because the Jews at the time would not accept Jesus as the Messiah, and because the Jews in general at the time were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, which I think is historically true, although I'll point out that it was actually the Romans who did it, and number one, and number two, that the whole thing was a Jewish affair. I mean, let's face it, Jesus was a Jew, his followers were Jews, and it was kind of an inter-Jewish matter, and there were reasons. Putting that aside, the fact that the Jews at the time rejected Jesus and called for his crucifixion, which strangely actually led to this idea that he died for the sins and all of that. But putting that aside, it's complicated. Jews at that time, and ever since by Christians who are true believers, in many cases, they have been viewed as, by rejecting Jesus, they will be viewed as subversive and as revolutionary, that they want to overthrow Jesus. And I would just say to that, I understand it somewhat. It is a Christian belief. I don't want to get into a discussion of it too much, other than to say that Judaism does not exist as a reaction to anything else. It's not that we're not here because we don't believe in Jesus, or we don't believe in Mohammed, or we don't believe in anyone else. Judaism is here as a genuine, organic, dynamic faith, a covenantal faith, one, by the way, that Jesus of Nazareth, according to the book of Matthew and according to the book of Acts, acknowledged as such, that the covenant, as Jesus is purported to have said, is forever. And forever means forever. That the covenantal relationship between the Jews and the creator of the universe is something that existed many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years before Jesus, and it continues to exist. So we exist as a faith in and of ourselves. We have our sets of beliefs. We're not reacting to anyone else. We don't exist because we reject anyone or anything else. Now, personally, I happen to believe in the dual covenant idea. Now, I know that some very religious Christians, particularly religious Catholics, reject that. But the way I see it is that Jesus, who I think it obviously was probably the most important person to ever live, he was able, through his ministry and through his followers, to bring the ministry of the Torah, the word of God according to Jewish understanding, given by God at Sinai to the world, through their intermediary, who was Moses and the children of Israel. And all of its moral and ethical precepts, he was able to bring that to the world in a way that the Judeans were not. He brought the moral and ethical code that has created Western civilization, that has created the United States. I mean, I think that's what I would call the dual covenant. So the covenant for the Jews continues, and yet the new covenant for the Christians grafted into it is there as well. All right, I'm getting a little off the topic, so let me get back to my main theme here. So very religious Christians rejected Judaism. Let me point out that St. Augustine of Hippo very explicitly laid out the Catholic position and the early Christian position, which was that Jews are not to be harmed, that Jews are not to be in any way molested in their worship, and that generally Jews are to be respected because they continue to embrace the original covenantal faith. However, that Jews are not to hold certain positions in Christian society, and that's true. That's why Jews were not allowed to be farmers. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to engage in certain trades. And, they weren't allowed to speak too publicly, and there was a special head tax for Jews in the Christian world. This is why a lot of Jews went into banking and trading. And this is why a lot of Jews became diplomats and bankers to various Catholic and Christian kings and nobles, lords, and heads of state. But the point is that that's something that has not been fully adhered to, and it was compromised, frankly, in a major way by the Protestant Revolution as well, the Reformation. But the criticism of Jews, thus emanating from the fact that we did reject Jesus's ministry, it's a Christian anti-Semitism, became more political and more racial, frankly. Racial during the Spanish Inquisition, when the Spaniards first brought up the fact that Jews who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism still were not really Catholic because of their race. Some of them actually weren't Catholics. They were secret Jews. They continued with that. That's a complicated question. We'll put that aside. But the fact is that this is when racism first entered the picture, that because of their genetic background, the Jews were Jews and they had certain specific characteristics. That started anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism means it's race-based as opposed to just anti-Judaism, which is religious-based. That was the predominant view before that. And that this basically led to, it further advanced and accelerated this idea that the Jews were subversive. They were now no longer subversive religiously because they didn't accept Jesus, and thus they were seen as reactionary and undoing of Christianity, which is completely false, as I said. But then it went into a racial matter. Suddenly they're subversive because of their birth. They can't help it. They're born that way. And that's where you ended up with the Nazi race theories, frankly, that, somehow people are predetermined at birth. They don't have free will. There's no idea that you can change yourself. You're born with these characteristics. You're just basically an actor on the stage. You don't have any inherent beliefs. And it was this kind of anti-Semitism that it combined with the belief in subversion that led to the accusation that the Jews were responsible not just for communism, but also for Judaizing influences within Christianity. Jews have been blamed for the Albigensian heresy, for the Hussite movement in Bohemia, for the Protestant movement by Catholics, for the Anabaptists, for the British break away from the church, because they said these were Judaizing influences. It had nothing to do with Judaism. The reason they were Judaizing is because they were looking at the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament, what we call the Tanakh, and they were seeing that there was wars conducted, there was commands to fight and to annihilate certain people, and that's thus the Jews are the responsible when this kind of thing happens. First of all, there's a major contradiction there because the Torah only addresses very specific people at very specific times in history. There's nothing to do in that way with modern interpretations of people coming around in the 14th century and saying, we could kill you because you're like a Canaanite or something like that. It's not only a complete misinterpretation, but that's a Jewish heresy. Jews are not allowed to read the Torah like that. You're not allowed to just go in as an unqualified person. Reading the Torah takes a great deal of learning and spirituality and heightened awareness, and you have to live an exemplary life before you could even qualify to start interpreting Torah. But yet they also criticize the Talmud because the Talmud they say it's a new religion. Not at all. The Talmud is consistent with the Torah. It's commentary on the Torah, as are the Responsa and the Midrash and other writings. These things are not contradictory at all. They help explain and bring the Torah, in a sense, to conditions of life as it advances in this world. They give meaning to the Torah. They give logos to the Torah, to use a Greek term. And yet the Christians, or the early Christians, railed against Talmud. They burned Talmuds because they claimed that the Talmud had some insulting comments in there about Jesus, which, by the way, is not true. I mean, it's, we could talk about that. That's a separate matter. But the point is that eventually, let me just bring it up to modern times because I want to wind down here. Some Christians blame Judaism for the development of communism. Some blamed it for the development of capitalism. Karl Marx wrote a pamphlet called On the Jewish Question, which I've written a book about this as well. It is one of the most viciously anti-Semitic tracts ever written. Now, Marx was born a Jew. His family converted to Lutheranism when he was 3 years old. He was baptized. He was a devout Christian at the time he went into the university. He actually wrote a book about Jesus that was, it was very, pro-Christian, profoundly so, before he went into the university, and he came out of the university as a Marxist. I mean, this is very typical in a way today of what happens. He was imbued by Hegelian ideas and other so-called Enlightenment ideas at the time, and so he came out and he viewed Judaism both as a race and as an idea, and he felt that by eradicating Judaism or annihilating it, as he said, he could advocate the annihilation of these ideas. What are these ideas? He referred to them: huckstering, money, and self-interest. In other words, self-interest means that you're an individual first, and that you're conscious of living your life according to your own dictates, controlling your own destiny, functioning, in a context of, helping yourself first. Huckstering, that's free trade, goods and services, ideas between us, personal relations, professional relations with other people, with other nations. That's natural, that's good, that Judaism does encourage it. And finally, money. Money is nothing but an abstract form of property. That's an attack on property. Money is a means of exchange, because we cannot have an economy that barters everything, because we don't always want what the other person has. We invent money, and we would invent money no matter what. Ancient man invented money. You have to have money. You have to have a means to exchange goods and services and ideas. Otherwise, we're going to starve to death. Marx wanted to abolish money because it got in the way of his very, very demented Enlightenment view of human progress, which was the march toward total equality, where all of mankind becomes part of an international beehive, an ant colony, where we become lobotomized. And so Marx railed against Judaism and claimed that Judaism was responsible for Christianity and it was responsible for the United States. Now, we are not responsible for those things. I would simply point out that we embrace values that encourage those developments. Western values that Christianity also embraces, by the way. We believe that the individual is created in the image of God. We're not gods. Marx believed that humans are gods. They can change human nature. They could create a new kind of man. We believe that we are nothing more than images of God, and as such, we can have a positive effect on our own lives and on the world, but within the limited context of the short life of the human being, who's imperfect. Only God is perfect. This is the Jewish ideal. This is the ideal that America is founded on. Now, some Christians blame the Jews for communism because they say we're involved with messianism. Christianity, of course, is messianic. They believe in the Messiah, Jesus, but that's a controlled Messiah. That's a Messiah that's interpreted by bishops and popes and cardinals, and that's good. And I admire that, actually. I hope that the church continues to do so in a way that inspires all of us. Same thing with Protestant churches. It's decided by their hierarchy. Jews don't have that because we don't believe in a Messiah. So yes, we are vulnerable to messianic ideas. However, the Jewish Messiah it only comes about if the people of the children of Israel have reached a level of observance and holiness and ethical and moral behavior, that the conditions might be set for that. It can't be brought about by arms. So, this is, again, a misinterpretation by Christians. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. This is a very complicated subject. I am very angry and depressed and upset and pained over what's happened yesterday. I'm still trying to process it. I'm going to leave this where it is. I will come back to it, I'm sure, probably do a series on it, and maybe even write another book about it. And all I can say is that innocent Jewish souls were murdered brutally for being Jews in America. That is a disgrace for America, not just for Judaism. I mean, a time for mourning for Judaism, but it is deeply shocking, and I think we should learn the lesson that we need to defend ourselves. We need to come out against doctrines that would advocate such things and people who would advocate such things. They should be identified. They should be publicly isolated and shamed and watched, and we should not apologize for this. And also, let's stop this crap with politicizing. Did he like Trump? Did he hate Trump? Somehow the left wants to blame President Trump for this. That's despicable and loathsome. Those people should be, it's just a disgrace. Anyways, I want to thank you for watching, everyone, and have a great day.